Hello folks, and welcome to episode 137 of Retropower Uncut. And we are going to start with Project One MK1 Escort, the second of the two consecutive MK1 Escort projects that are very similar. Pretty much a replay of last week, so I'm not going to go to town talking about this because it's another wheel arch. You saw other wheel arch last week. Tom's been getting on with this wheel arch this week. I think day before yesterday he was welding it in. Weld lines around here, you can just see the heat signature from the edges of where that was welded in. He's now doing the laborious task of metal finishing the quarter panel here. He's just blending it out now. He's tapped and filed it, or he's hammered and filed it all up. Hammer and dolly, bring up any low spots, file it to find the high spots and low spots, use that to show what's going on. Continue. Lots of hammering, filing. We bought some nifty little body files not very long ago, a few weeks back actually. Some pre-done ones. We've tended to make them ourselves before, but found a guy selling some of these, and they were at a reasonable price. We got a couple of these, and they're bang on for filing into this radius and doing a nice job there. So he's been doing that. Got all that pretty good. Got all the weld line pretty good. Got all the panel leveled up. You can see that's all been done. That's all looking pretty good. So really, he's just down to finishing blending that, and then tapping up the actual bulbous part of the arch, just to smooth that out and iron out any wobbly bits. In the meantime, Sam's working on the inner arches, continuing those in parallel with that. The other side, the outer's finished, so the inner's getting done. Next week, we'll be on to front end panel up. I'm actually not here next week, I'm on holiday next week, but they'll be on to front end panel up, line up the front wings, line up the bonnet, centralise everything on the front, which is a horrendous job. And will involve a lot of hair loss and swearing. They'll get everything lined up on the front, all the panel gaps set, everything in place, ready, so that we can carry on with the work on the front, getting the wheel arches grafted into the front wings. So that's where we're at on that one. Moving on, from behind the gas bottle on the welder, Stu's working on the front of Project Churchill, Mark II Jag 2-door coupe. And you'll recall, if you're a regular watcher, that we mentioned last week that the front suspension had all come together quite well, and it has, as you can see by the steering lock and the large wheel fitted. And the subframe is in. I'm still waiting on some bolts. I was a bit remiss in not ordering them, and then I struggled to find. There's not an awful lot of people keep 9/16 by 3.5 inch long UNF bolts in stock. Nobody locally, amazingly, at all had any 9/16 diameter UNF 3.5 inch long bolts. So I've had to order them online, so I'm waiting for them to arrive. A couple of days, probably be here tomorrow, I think. Then we can bolt the steering rack in place, and that's the final piece in the puzzle in there. The rack's in a box under the car. It physically fits and lines up and does what it should do, but we've not been able to actually bolt it solidly into place. But other than that, cross members all in. It's chocked in place. Stu's put the front bushes into it. It's bolted to the jig so it can't move, and it's all lined up. He's got the front bushes in, and he's just making up the front mount. Well, I'll explain. We're reinforcing the chassis rails. We, and probably anybody else that's owned a Mark II Jag, are a bit concerned by the strength of the rails on these. They're not very strong, and we've actually had to notch them a little bit as well to clear ancillaries on the engine. So what we've decided to do is build these reinforcer sections for the rails, which will also tie into the subframe mounts. And further back, this is an outer one. This will go on the outside face of the chassis rail. That's where the subframe mount connects to there. That picks up the front bush. That's a 2-layer piece. That's a 2mm thick mild steel, cardboard templated. Photograph the cardboard, import the photograph as a canvas into Fusion 360, draw around it in CAD, picking up all the key hole centers and whatever, and then generate that, and then do an offset to generate a little doubler plate. So we've got 2mm main plate, 16 gauge, 1.6mm thick doubler plate, and that's a pretty decent. That's 3.6mm thick in that area, so it's pretty sturdy. And we'll have the same then on the inside face of the chassis rail. So these, both sides, that edge butts up to the original lip sticking out on the rail there, and then these dodge down sections are for MIG stitch welds to sit into, and then we're going to weld in all the circles there, stitch weld along the bottom, and and then those pick up the original subframe mounting bolt holes in the rail as well. So it's a pretty robust arrangement. We're going to put those both sides of the rail, and then further back in this sort of region, but on the inner one, there's a plate which is going to pick up the front subframe rear mounting bush in this sort of region here, and then above it there'll be a mounting point for the actual engine mount, all of which will tie into the reinforcer plates, all of which will tie into the chassis rail. So it's a pretty robust arrangement, nothing's going to go too far awry there. We're using Jaguar Series 3 Jaguar XJ subframe mounting bushes with this new subframe, and the front ones have a large bore through the middle, and then Stu's just made these barrels. These barrels drop through the large bore to sleeve it down to an M12 bolt. Originally they had a big pin through. It's totally overkill. There's no need for anything bigger than an M12 to hold that on. The car would be torn to shreds before an M12 bolt broke. So that barrel drops through the mounting bush, and then an M12 bolts through, sandwiches everything up, sandwiches it all into those the plates that Stu's just putting the edges on these, putting the little curved returns onto these now. He's just tapping those over now, and then they'll all get lined up, clamped in place, and all welded in place on the rails. It's got a threaded bar through the bushes to keep them in line and check for squareness. Check that for straight first, then put that through, check for alignment, make sure everything's square and true at the front of the car, which it should be because it's all bolted in place on the jig, but it's just a double check, make sure everything lines up. But yeah, it's all looking good. George has pretty much finished the drawings for the upper wishbones. We had a bit of a dilemma on that, in that the upper wishbone bushes that we'd used, or that we bought, the new ones that we bought, there were two pairs we've got from two different suppliers, and they were both different OD and different bores, which confuses a little bit, very slightly, but they're a press fit bush, they press into the wishbone. Problem is, obviously, if we size the wishbone to the incorrect bush size, we could end up with the bushes being loose in future if they ever need to be changed. So we need to size them to the OE bush size, so we've got the best chance of the aftermarket bushes actually fitting correctly. I know of a situation with an aftermarket car manufacturer, shall we say, in the past, where a wishbone was sized to an aftermarket ball joint, and said aftermarket ball joint was actually made undersized. And so when aftermarket ball joints from a different manufacturer that actually did resemble the original size were fitted, it seized the ball joints up. So it's something that you have to watch out for with aftermarket parts. They may not be to OEM drawing, and then you're within the variability of the aftermarket then. So it's always best to try and verify what the original OEM dimensions were, and make any part that's got to have a service item fitted to it to the OEM drawing. That way you've got a good chance of it not creating a great big problem further down the line. So anyway, bit of background, that's where we're at on that. Moving on again, we will pause by the CV8, and I'll walk round to the back because it's the back that's really relevant on this. I'll put my little prop over here, that's a separate thing. Bobby's working in on the back of this. Parcel shelf sits in here, it's actually in the car at the minute, carbon fibre parcel shelf. Bear with me a minute, I've got hiccups. The parcel shelf's in the back. That's going to be bonded into the shell and bonded and screwed to the body, to the chassis unit, if you like. It's actually a tub, but it's going to be bonded and screwed to the steel part of the chassis body combination. They're a funny car, this is why I'm getting slightly confused there. They have a body shell, which is the carbon fibre part now, and then they have inserted steel parts within that unbolt from the floor pan, and then they have two big chassis tubes, and then they have a chassis tub, if you like, which forms part of the body that is actually integral with the chassis. So a bit of a strange arrangement. They're neither a monocoque nor a separate chassis, they're kind of somewhere in between the two. But anyway, regardless of that, Bobby's making up some brackets which go across the back here that are going to carry the body shell and carry the boot lid hinges and carry the parcel shelf as well. So they're multi-action sort of brackets that are all cantilevered off the last really structural part of the car, which is this big cross tube that goes across the rear suspension towers. They used to house the rear spring and shock, the rear shock absorber units, not the springs, because it was leaf sprung originally. Obviously it's now independent rear suspension, now has a Jaguar outboard brake independent rear suspension setup, which we'll come on to in a minute. So they're redundant, but they're an incredibly strong part of the car. So we're tying the mountings for all that into that. Now Bobby's been working on a revised boot hinge arrangement. We're remaking the boot in carbon fibre. We're going to take a mould off this, but in order to do that, we need to do some work on the inside of the boot to make it makeable in carbon fibre, because originally it had this steel tube sort of frame inside it, which is a bit clunky, a bit agricultural, and not really what we want if we're making it in carbon. So we're actually going to do a shaped former in foam and filler inside there to enable a mould to be taken off for the inner reinforcer. But we also need to move the boot hinges, partly to clear the fuel tank, and partly because we would just want to redesign them anyway, because the original ones were basically built from bits they found in the scrap bin, I think. So Bobby's re-engineered the boot hinges so that they allow the boot to open further without hitting the rear window, which was another problem, in that because we've made the glass flush now, it's actually slightly further out in the body. Not very much, but it means that the original boot lid would touch the glass if it opened too far. Moving the glass has meant that it was, and the boot lid basically only opened to about there. So he's revised the boot hinge arrangement so that the boot can open quite a lot further, and remounted them further outboard to give us more fuel tank clearance, because there's a great big fuel tank got to go in there. And he's now making the reinforcing sections to mount the boot hinges on. So that's what's going on there. Reverting to what I was talking about a minute, sorry, actually going back to this again for a minute. It's another case of cardboard aided design being another, so we're using the technology to the maximum effect rather than just using too much technology, if you like. There's a couple of times, I showed you on the chassis rails on the Mark II Jag, Bobby's done the same on here. Rather than doing too much 3D scanning and an awful lot of 3D CAD to generate these, it's actually much more efficient, save the time on data processing and the time scanning. It's actually very quick to do a very quick mock-up when you're not too sure of the shape. Bobby's done a very quick mock-up in cardboard, then literally hacked out some mock-ups out of a bit of old scrap galvanised sheet he had lying around, made up the boot hinges, checked they're going to actually work through the arc he needs them to work through and that the angles are all correct. And then he's literally taken those hacked out pieces, photographed them, imported them as a canvas into Fusion with the key dimensions on them, and then he's just, again, drawn the CAD drawing around them manually to generate these hinges, and then CNC plasma these, CNC profile these out on our CNC cutter from that drawing. So it's a really efficient way of doing it, because the time involved is incredibly little, considering how, you know, it's such a small amount of time, it's such a big result. It's just a really quick way of doing it. The photograph, import the photos of canvas, draw around it approach. It's crude, but it's so effective for stuff like that. You know, in an hour you can have done a huge amount of work, so it's just a really good way of doing it. Reverting back to when I mentioned the independent rear end, again, people who have watched us on YouTube for quite a while will know this has it's a bit of a hybrid rear end. Effectively, I already had lying around a Series 3 X, or Series 2 or Series 3 XJ Jag rear end kicking around in a pile of axles somewhere. So I've used the cage and the diff from that. But we wanted to go outboard brake, both on this car and on the E-Type that we are, sorry, on the Churchill Jaguar, and possibly on the E-Type. Certainly on these two, we want to go outboard brake. A few people have questioned us on that. Why not stick with the inboard brake? I prefer the outboard brake. Yes, the inboard minimises unsprung weight, but the difference in unsprung weight isn't that much, and I'd rather cool the brakes properly. If you run the brakes inboard, you can't cool them properly. They cook the diff seals, they cook everything around them, and you overheat the brakes almost very, very easily. It's a major problem on racing E-Types and that kind of car, cooking the brakes. They're really difficult to keep cool. Obviously they run ducted air to them and all sorts of things. We don't want to do that on a road car. This car's going to have around 600 horsepower and around 600 foot-pounds of torque, and it's it's a reasonably light car. It is, I guess I've undermined my own argument there slightly by saying it's reasonably light, in that would take load off the brakes, but it's going to be an incredibly quick car. It needs a lot of brake performance. I don't really want the brakes hidden under the middle of the car, so we're running outboard brakes where we can keep them cool. But to do that, we need a combination of parts, or to lean on the Jaguar parts bin and go for the late XJS outboard brake rear end, which was fitted by Jaguar themselves for a short period of time on the very late XJSs, which effectively used XJ40 outer hub carriers, hubs, drive shafts, but with the original old type Jag IRS cradle and diff. I've just concocted my own on this using X308 uprights, drive shafts, etc., but the early type Jag cradle. And that's all going to be rebuilt by Simply Performance are actually going to supply us the final rear end. Simply Performance Jaguar specialists. We've done a bit of work with them in the past. We may or may not have mentioned them in the past. But Ben at Simply Performance is incredibly helpful. It's helped us out with a lot of parts for this car. The seats came from Simply Performance. A number of the suspension parts have come from them. We've been getting all the suspension bushes and various other parts from them. But he's actually going to be building the final rear axles for both of these cars. That one's even more of a hybrid, but I won't go into that right now on a tangent. But as part of that, this car's also running wire wheels. The point I'm trying to get to here is this car's going to be running wire wheels. This is an example of an original X300 or XJ40 or X308, all the same from Jaguar. Rear hub, rear drive flange, which is the end of the drive shaft, which, as you will know with Jaguar, also forms the upper wishbone. The drive shaft is the upper wishbone. I want to replace this part with a part to accept a wire wheel and a knock-on spinner. Nobody makes those to my knowledge at the moment, so I've been put in touch with a specialist that does make those by Ben at Simply Performance. He's put me in touch with a company called Orson Engineering, I think they're called. And I've just stripped one of these down and cleaned it up so I could send them the photos of this to explain what we need for them to establish what splines they've got to put in it, because I want them to make this, rather than doing a bolt-on adapter onto there to take the spline knock-on type affair, I want to do it as a one-piece item with no bolted joint in the middle, do it as a one-piece knock-on spinner type hub. So that's in the hands of those guys now to get back to me to let me know whether they can do it, which I think they should be able to, and then when they can do it, which I don't imagine will be too much of a problem either. So yeah, that's what those bits are. They're a bit that was cleaned up, which will very soon be posted off to Orson Engineering, so they can have a look at it and decide how best to go about making me some wire wheel hubs for this car, for the Jensen CV8. Moving on from that, we'll dodge around Bobby, who's beavering away on his brackets here, and we'll come round here and dodge by a Scott. We'll come to the Allegro, which Scott's working on. I'm going to be cramped in here a bit. If I go this side would make better sense, wouldn't it? I'll go that side. Oh, I can sit down, look. Oh, I can sit down on camera, it's amazing. I don't do a lot of sitting down. This area here is current focus of attention. I think last week we mentioned the sills. Scott had made up the stepped inner sill sections. He's cut a lot of bracing out now. We changed some of the bracing into bolt-in bracing, and then we removed some altogether because we've got the car now, we've got the Allegro body shell pinned in place. Well, it's bolted in place in 6 places. Nothing's moving now. So we're happy that that's fairly dimensionally stable. So we've removed a lot of the extraneous bracing. We fitted the driver's seat back in, fitted the pedals in, fitted the steering column in, thrown the Allegro dash in and had a bit of a sit in it and a check. And interestingly, I'll pick up on some questions and answers in a short while, but one of the questions I'd seen, and one of the more a comment really than a question, was some slightly incoherent comment really regarding the pedal positioning in the car. I mean, my initial reaction would be, well, the pedals are in exactly the same place as they are on a Honda Integra because the floor pan is a Honda Integra. The only change we've made to the floor pan is behind the seat. So from the positioning of the driver relative to all the controls, it's exactly as per DC2 Integra. Now, I suppose there would be a question over where that sat in relation to the Allegro, and the answer is the pedals sit within an inch of the same position, possibly within half an inch of the same position. I don't know exactly because I can't put the Allegro pedals back in now, but certainly the bulkhead is within a few millimetres of the original Allegro bulkhead position, and the pedal positions are certainly within half an inch of the original Allegro pedal positions. With the seat in the car, the seating position is like a long-legged person's seating position in an Allegro, really. So nothing to report, really. It's a pretty unexciting part of the job. We were pretty confident, following the very early scans that George and Cal did, that none of that was going to really present too many difficulties. The difficulties were going to be structural loads, making sure structural loads were managed nicely, making sure we've got room to build structure without compromising interior space, and neatly joining up the parts of the two body shell, which is what we're working on now. One of the areas we needed to address that we'd realised was going to be possibly a slight difficulty, but only slight, was that we wanted to keep the Integra DC2 HVAC system because obviously it's considerably better than an Allegro one. And one of the areas of slight surprise, which I think I mentioned last week, is that this slot in the Integra bulkhead here, this letterbox slot that I'm poking my fingers down through here, is actually the outlet to the demister vents on the Integra. What you have to remember is that the Integra has a very long windscreen, much longer screen and a much deeper, the dash is deeper and comes a lot further forward. So that was actually sat under the lower part of the screen on the Integra. On this, the screen is much more upright, so starts much further back. So at that point, this screen outlet is in the wrong place and is actually in the area of the scuttle that we want to use for fresh air intake to the HVAC unit. So we had a slight concern we're going to have to do something a bit clever with a bit of metalwork and ducting here. What we've actually found is that we can remove the outlet ducting from the HVAC unit, and we're going to 3D print a new one of those that's a different shape, and then we can keep it all below this part of the bulkhead, and we can blank this area off completely and no longer have anything coming through there, and this will just be blanked off. Then we can use this as the air intake. This is going to be closed in by a closing panel, which also adds the strength, with 3 access holes in it so that we've got access to putting the wiper mechanism in. The back of that area will be closed off again structurally to bring some strength into this part of the bulkhead area. Yeah, once this the section at the back is closed in structurally, the section at the front's closed in with its access holes, we'll then be able to draw fresh air through. The access holes will be closed off by blanks as well. We'll be able to draw fresh air through there into the plenum area, and then through the existing Integra original air intake hole, the complete original Integra HVAC unit with all its intake ducting and all of its outlet ducting bar the original screen vents. And we're going to modify the dash face vent outlet so that we can more conveniently duct that into the Allegro dash. And I think the current plan is we're actually going to reuse the Allegro dash, just fitted very slightly further rearward. But yeah, it's all coming together very nicely. In terms of structure, Scott's working on the closures for the end panels. He's done the flanges for the replacement flanges for the bulkhead. We're boxing in the ends of the bulkhead now and forming a cavity here, which will be quite structurally strong. He's made these top hat sections, which are a reinforcer for the outer A-post structure. There'll be a panel from the outer part of the A-post. There was never a panel there originally on the Allegro, but we're going to panel in from the outer part of the A-post forward across this top hat section onto this original, that's the original Integra DC2 bulkhead end flange, and that's the original reinforcer section that it originally had a closing panel over it, but that's the original reinforcer section for the inner wing, and that's the original inner wing top rail. We're going to remove the extension from it. Scott has removed the extension from this side, it's still on that side. So he's making an extension for the top rail to come back into the scuttle there. He's made the new A panel, made the top hat. He's going to make the closing panel for this, which is then also going to tie into the inner wing here, into a hollow structure that comes forward, and then we'll make new sections which spot well to the top of this wing, which will go inboard a little bit to carry the Allegro wings, because the Allegro wings sit about 40 mm inboard of the original Integra wings. So we'll make a new panel as like a Z section that sits off the top of the DC2 wing to carry the Allegro wing above there. Whew, marathon effort. So that's all that coming together. The other part on this is the front suspension, which Scott's thrown together the original DC2 suspension, bolted that on there so that we could mock up for the front wheels. We're not using the original Honda wheels. We're using a mini light style wheel. Warren at Revolution Wheels has been very helpful as always. We know him quite well. He is making it, well, he's not personally, but his business is making us up a set of mini light type 8-spoke wheels, as they do, but with 5 stud to suit the Honda hubs and the correct offset for what we require for this car. So yeah, Revolution are making us the wheels. For the minute, we've got a bit of a mock-up setup using the Honda wheel plus spacers and things, just to mock it up, to try to make sure that we've got clearance on the A-panel area before Scott puts too much metalwork time into this and then finds it hits. We've got plenty of clearance though, we've got loads of clearance, there's no problems at all there. So everything's looking really quite good. And don't worry, those spacers aren't going to be on the final car. They're just a test item that's on here while we're offering wheels up and checking offsets and checking clearances. So ignore those, they're not going on the final car. I'm waiting for the raft of comments about those. At that point, we'll finish in here. I think that pretty much finishes off. And following on from that, and before I do a handover, just addressing a couple of questions, because people were asking about the Q&A, so I'm going to do a few. I think Cal will do a few as well. I've picked a few, he'll just have to make sure he doesn't pick the same ones as me. So, I've got one here that says, from Mr. 57 Black Beauty, who says, just as a matter of interest, do you keep track of the hours that go into making one of the arches for the Escort build from sheet metal to finished metal? Got to be nearly the cost of a little car. Don't know about it being the cost of a little car. Yes, we do keep track of the hours. We keep track of the hours of every single job via an app that we all have on our phones. We have several apps. We have the Global Workshop app we use to keep track of the actual visual progress on the projects and of all the stock of materials. And currently we use a Zero Projects app to keep track of all of our hours. And yeah, every hour is logged. So we know exactly what hours we spent on them. I'm not about to broadcast what hours are spent on them. However, no, it's not the cost of a small car. Not to do one arch. To do a full set, probably yes. But no, not to do one arch. And no, I've seen another question somewhere asking about selling them. No, we're not selling them. There are 2 cars being built with those wheel arches, and that is it. There are, they're not for sale. They're not ours to sell. They belong to the customer. The customer has paid us the hours to make those tools. He's paid for those tools. He's paid for us to fit them to the car. They're not ours to sell, and we wouldn't want to sell them in any case, because the exclusivity is that they're the only 2 that are done like that. And if it was easy to do, everybody would do it, and then they wouldn't be exclusive, and then the interest in the car wouldn't be there. So no, there's just those 2. Yes, we do keep track of the hours. I'm not going to say how much they are, but no, they're not the cost of a little car. And another one I've got from Patrick H, who says, all looking good. Thinking through the custom suspension geometry, how do you calculate the rack requirements to avoid bump steer? That's actually very simple. You draw up the parts, which can just be done in 2D, in fairness. For the basic check can just be done in 2D, as long as the rest of the geometry isn't too tricky. And you draw it up and you put the rack in the right place. Basically, for a given upper wishbone length and position, and a given lower wishbone length and position, a given upright, suspension upright, with this given distance between the ball joint, the upper ball joint and the wheel spindle, and the lower ball joint and the wheel spindle, your rack is dictated at that point. There's no more that you can do at that point. There is a rack length that will be correct for that. Well, depending on the height you're mounting the rack at, there'll be a rack length that is correct for that. There's no sort of nearer right, further from right, really. It's right till wrong. Now, obviously, if you're 1mm away from right, it's not going to have a lot of an effect. If you're 10mm away from right, it's going to have a huge effect. As luck would have it, we were quite fortunate in finding a rack that's within 1mm of perfectly perfect for the Mark II Jaguar Churchill project setup. So that was good. Ben Westgate commented on an idea for the Jensen seats, talking about Mercedes SL seats. We did look at Mercedes SL seats. They're far too big, unfortunately. That was one of the ones we looked at early on. I actually looked at those. Whilst most of the seat mechanism is quite small, there is one motor, I can't even remember what it does, I think it's the tilt motor, that sits miles down underneath the seat into a bit of a cavity, I think, and it just does, there's no way it fits. The rest of it wouldn't fit either, the bases are too high, but the one motor completely is far too deep, so no good, I'm afraid. But yeah, we did look at that. Rapidly moving on, Manx 1641 says, Morris clutch on my camper, I had a similar issue where the brakes would bind after using them for a while. Turned out to be the link rod between the pedal and the master cylinder was slightly too long, didn't allow the fluid to return. Yes, that's a really common reason for that failing, and yes, we've checked that, and no, that's not the problem. That's the standard response if you do get a brake lock on after a short period of driving. It's normally that the master cylinder pedal, the push rod, was slightly too long. It allowed the cylinder to refill, it allowed the fill port to open and the shut-off to open when you came off the pedal stationary without any heat in anything. But as soon as things warmed up and there was a bit of vibration involved, the cylinder won't clear, the piston won't clear the fill port and the brake seize on. But no, it's not that. We obviously have checked that, and that isn't the problem. Another question, Pectorialis, question, can you use the moulds for the CV8 again if you ever wanted to make another one? We could use the moulds again, yes, but only for the customer that we're building that car for. Again, a bit like the Escort wheel arches, those moulds are owned by the customer of the CV8, nobody else. We don't own them, they're owned by him. He might allow us to use them, we would have no particular desire to do so without, A, we wouldn't do it without his permission, and B, his car is his car. It's up to him what he wants. If he wants to sell body mouldings for it, he can. I doubt he would. So that's the situation with that. And I think that pretty much wraps up a brief go through the questions and answers. I'll let Cal have another go through that in a short while. On that note, I'm about to hand over to Cal, but there's one little missing element that's occurred in the background this week, which is that the Project One Escort has gained its final paint. So I'll leave you having a look at that while we wait for Cal to take over.
do a video. What did John used to start with? Hello, viewers. Right, thank you very much, Nat. And the big reveal, the Escort Project One is now in paint. So we've put you all out of your misery in terms of what colour it's going to be. And really, really happy with the results. We were trying to aim for a colour that was a very fine line between whether it's blue or grey. And I think it's turned out absolutely spot on. So it's such a strange one. It changes in the light. I was almost worried when I saw it in the paint booth that it wasn't blue enough, but then I've occasionally glanced over at it in here and thought, yeah, it looks really blue. And it's so bizarre. Sometimes you'll look at it and think, no, it's just plain grey. And then sometimes you'll think, no, that's definitely like a greyish blue. And if I'm questioning that a lot, that means it's exactly what we were hoping for. So good, and really excited to start getting onto the build on it. So we're just in the latter stages of organising and planning and making sure everything's in place parts-wise on the shelving upstairs. And I've been going through with Alex, who started this week. He's now our electronics slash calibration engineer. So he will be doing wiring harness builds. So I'm excited to say that we will be able to show some of that. Obviously, going back over the last few years, we've generally been using Bremax for our wiring, who have consistently done a fantastic job. However, we've decided it's now the time to bring it in-house. And the side effect of that is that when we start building some wiring harnesses, we'll be able to show the detail, which is good, because it seems to be one of those slight black art things where there's not a lot of information on the net about it. So yeah, we've been going through this, and although we planned the routing of the wiring loom and relevant connectors when it comes to bulkhead connectors and that sort of thing when we did the metal work, so there's provision to clip the wiring in place and pass it through bulkheads and so forth. The actual sort of fine detail is now being planned at the moment, so Alex is working on the wiring plan now, and we should be moving on to the construction of that over the coming weeks. I think next week will probably see us starting to build our wiring harness build table, which will be good to see. So we're making a pretty large, I think it's 4 metre by 1.5 metre table that will raise up vertical or go down flat to build wiring harnesses on. So yeah, looking forward to getting stuck into the build. And I was just saying to the guys, I can't wait to see some of the accents on this. It's going to have bronzy coloured wheels and bronzy coloured anodised aluminium accents on it. So I think the door handles, mirrors, possibly the headlight bezels, and then various interior details like the instrument bezels will all be in a bronzy colour, which I think will complement this bluey grey really, really well. So yeah, on with the build soon. Morris. Power steering gremlins. Morris is really summing up at the moment that sort of final stage of the build part where, you know, a lot of people would think, yeah, the car's finished, but the last few bits can throw sort of curveballs at you, which can be surprisingly difficult to resolve, and it's got a perfect example now. So we've been chasing this power steering issue where the pressure relief valve kept sticking. Essentially, you'd drive the car, you'd start the car up, be fine, you'd drive the car, and the power steering, you'd lose power steering, and then it would stay lost, and every time we take the pressure relief valve out, it was slightly stuck. And it seemed like there was some kind of debris getting in there, only very fine, but something. It's a sliding shuttle in a bore, a tight-fitting bore, so any amount of sort of metal grit will stop it moving. So we concluded that those metal particles must perhaps have come in the reconditioned pump that we used. Seems like the only source, because the pipe work that we've all made is not metal pipe work. The reservoir, it's mild steel particles that we found, and the reservoir's aluminium, so it can't really be anything other than something that was already in there. So we decided to put a filter in it, and this is actually perhaps a little learning one for us. We put the filter in what we thought to be a logical point, which was the last point before the entrance to the pump. We've got the best chance of catching everything before it goes in the pump. But actually what we then created was an issue where although it's a 30 micron filter, which I felt to be the biggest we could go and actually meaningfully catch any particles, it was restrictive enough that it was causing the pump to cavitate, because it's only gravity fed from the reservoir. So we then had to backtrack on that, put a new feed pipe back in without the filter, and change the filter to being on the return to the reservoir, so it's being forced through it by the high pressure side of the pump. And we took the power steering pump off, washed all that out to be 100% sure there was no particles in that, washed the reservoir out, washed the remaining pipes out, and rebuilt it all with the filter on the return to the tank, and fingers crossed, so far, it's now working fine. However, we are also battling a small secondary issue. I don't know if you noticed in the previous episode, I might have had a cloth over the cap on the reservoir, and we've been having a little bit of a problem with fluid being pushed out of the vent in the cap. Having looked at that, it's actually a slight oversight in the design of the reservoir, in that we did a drilling up through the whole body of the reservoir so that the oil's returning to the top of the tank in a bid to give it a good chance of de-aerating as it kind of swirls down the walls of the tank back into the fluid. Problem we've got is it's actually forming a solid sheet of oil over the bottom of the neck that the cap sits into, which means any venting out actually draws that oil out with it. So we're going to have to just introduce some kind of little shield in there that just ducts the return oil back down rather than it being able to sheet across the top of the tank and over the inside of the cap. But hopefully with that done, that will be all the steering gremlins sorted, and we can get back onto the road and seeing how we get on from there. So we're sort of slowly getting through, but it's nice that we're making positive progress on it. And then Land Cruiser, we saw that firing up for the first time last week. That all went well. What we wanted to do straight after that first fire up, which we did I think on the Friday last week actually, was just take the cam covers off and check that we've got oil circulation to the heads. Something that's always a sort of slight concern is that when you first fire up an engine like that we've built, although you've got confirmation that there's oil pressure at the sort of oil feed into the block, you don't have any instrumentational readout to show that where the oil is circulating within the engine, and it's an assumption that it's getting to the heads and getting to the cams. So we took the cam covers off just to make sure that oil was definitely circulating throughout, which it is. We've got a slight squeak which we're trying to identify, which I suspect might be the water pump. I'm hoping that it's just the shaft in a very new seal on it, and that it will stop after a while. But we'll keep monitoring that. In the meantime, Adam's on with some final bits of plumbing. We've got to do the servo vacuum pipe, which is making like quite a nice neatly formed ATEC hardline for that goes from the front of the throttle body round to the servo. And then there's also a coolant bypass from the back of the head to the thermostat housing, which is the only coolant flow through from the back of the heads when the heater valve is shut. And we've left that until now because I wanted to do another hard line that followed the line of the servo pipe, and until we'd made the servo pipe, I didn't know what shape that was going to be, so it just had a temporary pipe in there for the minute. So yeah, Adam's done really nice kind of parallel formed hard lines for those two. And then he's also been on with just finishing off the seat housing, or the fuel tank housing that the seat goes onto, and building up the seat frames. So we stripped and fabricated sort of custom frames for the seats using the original recline latches, and all those bits were painted, powder coated, plated or whatever. So it's just been building that up. We had to machine a couple of little nylon bushes because we realised that the original seats in the Land Cruiser had actually had the recline mechanisms kind of cobbled up with some badly fitting little spacers in them, which meant if you actually tightened the shoulder bolts up that form the pivots, they were binding up completely. So we've machined some nylon spacers, the correct size for that. So those, I think the seat frames are actually ready to go in now. And then George has been on with the mounting for a speaker. So in this we're using a JBL Bluetooth speaker, like a household type one, portable one. You can have power to them from a USB socket, so we can plug it in there for USB. And this was at the owner's request, just a nice simple Bluetooth speaker. So George has just been designing and 3D printing a little mount that sits under the speaker, bolts to the tunnel, and then it'll have two leather straps that are Velcro wrapping around it to secure the speaker. So simple but neatly executed. And then Tarks has been on with the shroud. So the column shroud on the Land Cruiser, originally, it stops short of the dash, and this is actually how they are. We haven't modified the depth of the dash, only the sort of height up and down. So where the column shroud sort of sits short, you can see the wiring to the column switch for a couple of inches, and we didn't really like that. So we're designing and 3D printing a deeper shroud that goes all the way to the dash, and also taking the opportunity to design it so it's more possible to upholster it neatly. So where the two halves go together, we've left like a 2 or 3 mil gap and left gaps around all the parts to allow for the thickness of the leather. So once we've made this, we leather it, and then it's not all going to be not fitting how it should. So yeah, that's the last bit there. Adam's also fitted the door cards now, so he's made the membranes that sort of seal the weather out from getting into the car and getting onto the door cards. I think he's fitted both the door cards now, certainly one of them, I think both, which were upholstered a while ago now by Dean at Trimworks. It's a combination of plain black leather, and then we had some woven sections, same as we've got on the seats, where we've had Spinneybeck do us some woven leather where they strip down the same leather we've used as the plain parts into 7mm strips, weave them and laminate them onto a sort of cotton backing, so it's nice and stable and the weave can't all go out of alignment. So that looks really cool. Happy with that, how that's going. So yeah, it's all coming together really, just got to finish those coolant things. George has also been working on the grille, actually, nearly forgot. So where the original grille sits, which is kind of on a bracket in front of the radiator, but behind the front panel, it's just a flat mesh with a frame around it. The original will no longer fit because we've got the aircon condenser in there now and the oil cooler in there. So we're designing something that's very similar, aluminium frame. George's done a 3D scan of the front, just because it's the easiest way to get the shape. And then he's plasmaed out an aluminium frame, made some little clips that allow it to just clip in at the bottom and then it'll bolt in at the top, and trial fitted that. That all looks good. So that's now out, so we can attach the mesh to it, paint it or anodise it black. And that can go in and that will be what holds the Toyota badge, which will be kind of the finishing touch on the front. So yeah, on that, it's actually all coming together nicely. We should sort of, the interior build, grille and sort of engine final bits of plumbing should all come together in reasonable synchronisation. So we're going to be getting to the point we can do the next step of calibration on the engine ECU, which may, I don't know whether to take it to the rolling road for the next session or whether to do another session of basic setup, how it is first, but yeah, watch this space on that. E-Type, James is on with the fuel system, so he is doing the swirl pot. You've seen previously we've done a billet top plate that goes onto the tank. That's got where the wiring pass through studs, which are isolated with little nylon top hats. It's designed that the pump actually threads up into it. And then that pump needs to sit into like a swirl pot or anti-surge pot, basically a container that will hold a small amount of fuel around the pickup pipe of the pump and hold it there regardless of what the cornering, braking, accelerational forces are. So when the fuel's running reasonably low, you don't find that when you corner hard, all the fuel sloshes away from the pickup and you lose fuel for a second. So the way we're doing that is he's fabricated a steel tray that sits in the bottom. It's got some small holes in it that will allow fuel to flow in from the tank but not quickly escape from it. And then that's actually going to be bolted into the bottom of the tank, into where the original kind of bung slash, essentially the same thing. There was a little pot that was a bung in the bottom of the tank, which is where the original mechanical pickup pipe went into. But it hung down under the tank, which I wasn't very impressed with because it's quite a long piece hanging under the car. So we're replacing that with a slim bung that will have a threaded hole in the top of it, and then our fabricated pot actually bolts into that from inside the tank, and then the pump assembly sits into that. And then it's designed that the fuel return to tank pipe goes down into that pot as well, so as the fuel circulates around the system and returns to the tank, it also continuously keeps that pot topped up. So that is coming together, and I think that will complete the fuel system on that. And then I think James will then be moving on to probably finishing off where he left off on the mounting of the PDM and ECUs behind the dash, with a view to, once we've done the wiring plan and loom for this, I think that will be the next one. We're moving on to wiring related tasks. And I think, as it stands at the moment, that is a pretty good summary of where we're at. So we'll catch up again next week, and I'll see you then. Don't forget t-shirts, hoodies, etc. in the shop, mugs as well. Knock yourself out. I'll see you next week.